there's no better way to really convey what was emotionally going on inside Carmelo Anthony in terms of his fearfulness than for him to get on the stand and to tell the jury about that. Look, they can hear from other witnesses, they can assess objective evidence and exhibits and everything under the sun. But until you hear from the person who's claiming they feared for their life, then it's harder to make that determination.
A routine high school track meet in Texas turns deadly. A 17-year-old student athlete is fatally stabbed in a crowded stadium tent, and the community is left shattered. Now, the first-degree murder trial of teenage captain Karmelo Anthony is officially underway in Texas during fierce national spotlight, social media debates, and intense protests outside the courthouse. With Anthony claiming self-defense and facing up to life in prison, the legal strategy in this courtroom is about to become a masterclass in high-stakes litigation. Welcome back to the U.S. Sun's YouTube channel. I'm exclusive reporter Israel Salas-Rodriguez. Be sure to click the like and subscribe buttons so you can stay with us for more great interviews like this. Joining us to unpack the Karmelo Anthony murder trial is attorney Eric Faddis. So Eric, can you just sort of set the scene for us and explain to us who the defendant is and what he's accused of doing?
Sure. So this is a highly publicized stabbing case that allegedly happened at a high school track meet. So there was this tent, and there were two students there. Karmelo Anthony, he's the defendant charged, and the Austin Metcalf, he is the alleged victim in the case. There are allegations that there was an exchange between the two, and things escalated. And ultimately, Mr. Anthony stabbed Mr. Metcalf, and Mr. Metcalf is now deceased. And so that's why there's sort of a renewed national attention on this case.
In terms of the defense, what is the likely strategy for Karmelo Anthony's team?
So, Israel, from the outset, at scene, Karmelo Anthony was telling police that he acted in self-defense, that he was trying to protect himself, that, hey, it wasn't somebody else who did this, it was him, but he had a legal reason to do it. And so that is absolutely the horse that they are going to ride going into this trial. And the jury is going to have to grapple with a lot of different legal issues, which can be attendant to cases involving claims of self-defense. And so the jury's going to have a lot to sift through. It's my understanding that jury selection is beginning now.
And you mentioned self-defense. So what does the defendant need to prove in the self-defense case?
So just to clarify, the defendant at a trial has no burden of proof. In fact, it's the prosecution's burden to disprove self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt. But when we're talking about self-defense, in this case, Karmelo Anthony had to have a reasonable belief that deadly force was necessary because Austin Metcalf was presenting an imminent risk of deadly force to Karmelo Anthony. And so that's a really big piece of it is whether the alleged victim was imminently going to exercise deadly force against Karmelo Anthony. There are a number of other sub-issues. Karmelo Anthony cannot have provoked this altercation, because if he provoked it, he cannot avail himself of a self-defense claim. On top of that, there's something that says if a person's engaging in criminal activity, they are not protected by the self-defense law, and there's some report that there might be a prohibition on an individual possessing a knife while on school grounds. Would that disqualify Karmelo Anthony from being able to run a self-defense defense in this case? These are all questions that need to be answered.
And how difficult is it for the prosecution to disprove a self-defense case in a murder trial?
Well, self-defense is really a case-by-case factual inquiry. And so here, one thing that helps the prosecution is the alleged victim, Austin Metcalf, did not have a weapon, according to reports. He didn't have a knife or some sort of club or something else. Karmelo Anthony, the defendant, is the only one who was armed during this altercation. But one thing that's going to matter too, Israel, is what was said during this very brief interaction inside the tent before the stabbing happened. Were there any threats that were levied one way or the other? Those things are very important. And the prosecution is going to have an additional hurdle because of the relative sizes of each participants. So Karmelo Anthony is reported to be about 5'9", 130 pounds. Austin Metcalf, the alleged victim, is reported to be 6 foot, about 225 pounds. That's a big boy. And then lastly, the reports indicate that Austin Metcalf, the alleged victim, was the first one to get physical. So if he was the initial aggressor, that's going to make it more difficult to disprove a self-defense from the prosecution standpoint.
What evidence will the jury likely examine when determining whether self-defense is justified in this case?
Sure. In looking at a self-defense claim, there are a number of factors that are really important. So the relative size of each participant, certainly what was said during any verbal exchanges leading up to this stabbing. On top of that, they're going to look at, hey, they're going to look at the surroundings. Inside this tent, could Karmelo Anthony have maneuvered around or left, although he had no duty to retreat, or was he essentially backed into proverbial corner? They're also going to look at, hey, was it multiple people against one? Did it appear as if multiple individuals were getting aggressive, or was it just these two who were involved in the ultimate stabbing? All of those things are critically important. Lastly, who was the initial aggressor? Who started this fight? And whether one party was armed or not, all of those are critical circumstances for the jury to consider.
And just circling back to the alleged knife that Karmelo Anthony had on his possession, does the fact that a knife was allegedly involved in this incident, does that help or does that hurt Karmelo Anthony's case for self-defense?
I think it only hurts because as a general rule, you can't bring a knife to a fistfight under the law. Generally speaking, if one party is armed and the other is not, and the individual who's armed kills that other person, it's really difficult to claim self-defense. Now, there are some other circumstances that could still allow Karmelo Anthony to claim self-defense, including that the alleged victim was a lot bigger and was the first to engage in physical contact, according to the reports. But the fact that Karmelo Anthony is the only one with a weapon, that's a problem for the defense.
Can a person claim self-defense if they willingly remained in the confrontation?
So this is a really important question because it differs by state. But here in Texas, there is what's called a stand your ground law, which essentially says a person can act in self-defense without first retreating. They don't have a duty to retreat. They don't have to try to run away from the scenario. They can effectively stand their ground so long as the other self-defense requirements are met. And so in this circumstance, Karmelo Anthony had no duty to try to leave the scene or to try to withdraw from, this encounter that was escalating. And I think that's a really important wrinkle legally because a lot of states don't have that. And we've seen prior cases where individuals have been acquitted on self-defense grounds in stand your ground states.
Now, Eric, I want to switch over to the prosecution side. What do prosecutors need to establish to secure a murder conviction here?
Sure. So they need to determine that Karmelo Anthony was the one who, in fact, stabbed Austin Metcalf. There's appears to be no significant dispute about that. But what's going to matter, too, is Karmelo Anthony's state of mind. I don't think there is any strong indication that this was some pre-planned, calculated, murder by design type thing. This was something that happened quickly. And so one was Karmelo Anthony acting in a reckless or negligent fashion when he brought about the death of another person through stabbing, or a knowing fashion. But really the central impediment for the prosecution is going to be disproving self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt. Because if there's a reasonable doubt as to whether this was self-defense, defense doesn't even have to prove that it was self-defense. If there's a reasonable doubt as to whether this event was self-defense, then the jury would have to acquit. So a number of hurdles for the prosecution as well.
What pieces of evidence will be most damning for Karmelo Anthony in this case?
I think it's going to be critical what other people who were around this incident heard and what they saw, because those witnesses are probably disinterested. They don't have an interest in this. They're not the victim. They're not the defendant. They are just, hopefully neutral, impartial witnesses. So did they hear any threats? What did they see in terms of the body positioning and in terms of physical contact, those kinds of things? What did they see in terms of, who was being more aggressive, who appeared to be the primary aggressor? Those are things that are hard to reconstruct, a year after the fact, but you do so via witnesses. And I think that witness testimony is going to be critical here.
Right. And I just also wanted to you play right into my next question is, how important will eyewitnesses be as compared to physical evidence?
Totally. So eyewitnesses are going to give a disinterested perspective as to what happened, assuming those witnesses don't have a bias for one side or the other. Now, if they're, a super good buddy of either the decedent or the defendant, the jury's going to have to weigh that in terms of assessing their credibility. And so those things are all really important too. And when we're talking about witnesses, there's probably no more important witness than the defendant himself. In self-defense cases, it's much more common for a defendant to take the stand and testify than in other types of cases. I think Karmelo Anthony is going to get up there, and I think his account is going to be pivotal in terms of how the jury sees what happened.
Would it be smart on the defense's side to actually allow Karmelo Anthony to take the stand in his own defense?
Gosh, in self-defense cases, a lot of times the attorney feels like they have to have their client take the stand because the jury needs to determine, hey, did Karmelo Anthony have a reasonable fear that he was facing imminent serious bodily harm or death? Well, there's no better source as to whether Karmelo Anthony had that fear than Karmelo Anthony. And there's no better way to really convey what was emotionally going on inside Karmelo Anthony in terms of his fearfulness than for him to get on the stand and to tell the jury about that. Look, they can hear from other witnesses, they can assess objective evidence and exhibits and everything under the sun. But until you hear from the person who's claiming they feared for their life, then it's harder to make that determination.
Are there any legal hurdles for the prosecution that they may face because this incident and this unfortunate death took place so quickly?
Sure. So this was not an incident that sort of built up over the course of days or weeks or anything like that. It appears that this was rather chaotic. It was just an event that happened in very quick succession. Things escalated so fast that it's sometimes difficult to parse out the details, especially a year later, especially when we're talking about witnesses who are, many of whom might be minors. Sometimes there are memory issues. Sometimes there are issues with recollecting clearly to a jury what these individuals saw. And so when you consider those circumstances, it's more difficult than a case, that was some planned out murder where we have text messages and we might have emails, we have, a trail of evidence leading up to it. Here, this is kind of a flash in the pan, and the prosecution has to prove a lot of things that happened within that very brief flash.
And according to the police report, Karmelo Anthony allegedly confessed to actually committing this a crime to police when he was arrested. What role could those statements play in his trial?
So it's not a whodunit, right? He went to police and he said, hey, it was me. And in fact, there's some statement where he says something like, it wasn't allegedly me. I did it. And so I think it does is it forecloses on the possibility of other potential defenses. When you have sort of a chaotic circumstance and something physical happens, you got to prove that it's the defendant who did it. Here, the defendant gave them that proof that he confessed that he was the one engaged in this activity. So, but on the flip side, perhaps the jury's going to see that and say, hey, Karmelo Anthony was being straight with police from the beginning. He admitted that it was him, and he asserted multiple times that he was doing this to protect himself. Maybe the jury is going to view that favorably.
And lastly, Eric, how much concern is there that the extensive social media coverage could affect the trial?
always a concern on both sides when you have a nationally publicized case, because you need to get fair and impartial jurors. Ideally, you want a juror who's never heard about this case. In this Texas community where things are very emotionally charged around this case, I don't know that you're going to find such a juror. So your next best option is finding someone who has not drawn a conclusion, who doesn't already have their own opinion as to whether this was self-defense or not. That is probably going to be more feasible, but it's going to be critical in jury selection to inquire of these jurors. Hey, what have you heard? How did it make you feel? Have you, a juror, posted anything about this case? All of these are sort of new considerations in the social media era that weren't present 30 years ago.
Well, Eric, I want to take the time again to thank you for taking the time to speak with us.
Yeah, Israel, always a pleasure, man. Good seeing you. I appreciate you having me.
Wow, the fact that we can potentially see Karmelo Anthony take the stand in his own defense raises a serious question as to whether that's a gamble his team wants to play at trial, seeing as how the prosecution can ask him pointed questions that can make the teenager uneasy on the stand in front of a pool of jurors that will determine whether he spends the rest of his life in prison. Once again, thank you for joining us. I'm Exclusives reporter Israel Salas-Rodriguez. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button so you can stay up to date with the latest videos like this. Thank you again. See you soon.